It started a few months after I moved to my new apartment. I'd landed my dream job and wanted to be closer to work. The building wasn't fancy, but it was safe, or so I thought. My unit was on the second floor facing a small parking lot, with big windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day. But at night, those same windows felt like they were watching me. The first time I noticed something was off, it was subtle. I was walking home from a late shift and had the distinct feeling someone was behind me. I turned around, but the sidewalk was empty. I chalked it up to nerves and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Then came the texts. At first, I assumed it was a wrong number. "You look nice in that red dress today," one said. I was wearing a red dress that day, but I figured it was a coincidence. When I replied asking who it was, there was no response. Over the next week, the messages kept coming. "You should smile more. You're cute when you tie your hair up. I love the way you walk." They were from different numbers every time, making it impossible to block them. I stopped responding altogether, hoping whoever it was would get bored. But they didn't. One night, I got home late after hanging out with friends. I was laughing, still buzzed from the drinks, when I noticed something on my door. A single flower, white and delicate, taped to my door. There was no note, no explanation. My stomach dropped. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the building felt like footsteps. I kept checking the locks, peering out the windows, but the parking lot was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. A week later, the flower appeared again. This time it was on my car. That's when I called the police. The officer who came was polite but dismissive. "It's probably just a neighbor with a crush," he said. "Let us know if it escalates." Escalates? What did that even mean? A few nights later, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, like someone tapping on glass. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from my bedroom window. I lived on the second floor. I forced myself to get up and peek through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing, just the faint glow of the streetlights. But then I noticed it, a shadow moving near the edge of the parking lot. I couldn't make out any details, but whoever it was stood there for a long time before slipping into the darkness. The police took this more seriously when I called them again. They checked the area but found nothing. They suggested I get a security camera. I bought one the next day and installed it in my window, pointing toward the lot. For a while, things seemed to quiet down. No texts, no flowers, no shadows. I started to convince myself it was over. Maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then I checked the camera footage. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just the occasional car driving by or someone walking their dog. But around 3 a.m., the figure appeared. They walked into the parking lot and stopped right in front of my building, staring up at my window. I couldn't see their face, but they stood there for over an hour before walking away. I showed the footage to the police, but without a clear image, they couldn't do much. They suggested I consider moving. Moving? I had just gotten comfortable here. I didn't want to uproot my life because of some creep. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started carrying pepper spray and a small personal alarm. I told my friends what was going on, and they made sure to walk me home whenever we went out. I even started taking different routes to and from work. But it didn't help. The messages started again. "Why are you avoiding me?" one read. "We belong together," said another. Then came the worst one. "You can't hide from me. I'm always watching." That night, I barricaded myself in my apartment, too scared to sleep. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a picture, a photo of me in my living room, taken through my window. I screamed and called the police. When they arrived, they found no one in the area. The officer looked at me with pity and suggested I stay with a friend for a few days. I packed a bag and left that night, crashing on my best friend Jenna's couch. She tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The next morning, Jenna went to work while I stayed behind. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock at the door. My stomach flipped. No one was supposed to know I was here. I crept to the peephole and saw a delivery person holding a bouquet of flowers. Relieved, I opened the door. The flowers were beautiful, bright yellow daisies, my favorite, but there was no card. "Who sent these?" I asked. The delivery person shrugged. "No name, just said they were for you." I shut the door and stared at the flowers, my hands shaking. How did they know where I was? That night, Jenna and I stayed up late trying to figure out what to do. I decided it was time to move. This wasn't just creepy anymore, it was dangerous. The next morning, as I packed my things, Jenna went to grab coffee. She was only gone for 20 minutes, but when she came back, she looked pale. "There's a man outside," she said. "I think he's watching the building." We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. I moved out of my apartment the following week, leaving no forwarding address. I didn't even tell most of my friends where I was going, just in case. For months, I jumped at every sound, every shadow. I kept the curtains closed and barely went out. Slowly, life returned to normal, but I never felt truly safe. The text stopped. The flowers stopped. It was as if they had vanished. But even now, years later, I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Because the thing about stalkers is, they don't just take your safety, they take your peace of mind. And once that's gone, it's nearly impossible to get it back.
Story number 2.
I didn't realize I was being watched until it was too late. It started on a chilly October night when I was walking home from my part-time job at the diner. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional car passing by. The air smelled of damp leaves and faint smoke from someone's fireplace. I had a long day and was looking forward to curling up in my small apartment with a cup of tea and a bad movie. As I turned the corner to my street, I felt it, an intense prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone's gaze was boring into me. I stopped, pretending to adjust my scarf, and scanned the area. Nothing. The sidewalks were empty. The houses were dark. I told myself I was imagining things and hurried home. The feeling didn't leave me. A few nights later, I worked a late shift again. This time, I felt the presence sooner, before I even left the diner. I stepped outside, my bag slung over my shoulder, and froze. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a man. He was partially hidden by shadows, but I could tell he was tall, with broad shoulders and a hood pulled low over his face. I walked quickly, glancing back every few steps. He didn't follow, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, watching. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking. I double-checked the locks on my door and tried to calm down. It's nothing, I thought, just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The next week, things escalated. I started finding strange things near my apartment door. First, it was a single black glove, neatly placed on the welcome mat. Then, a torn piece of paper with the words, "You're beautiful," scrawled in red ink. The worst was the photograph. It arrived in an unmarked envelope slipped under my door. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my window. In the photo, I was sitting on my couch, completely unaware someone was out there, watching. I called the police. They asked if I had any enemies or knew anyone who might be stalking me. I couldn't think of anyone. I was quiet, kept to myself, and didn't date much. They promised to patrol the area more often, but without a clear suspect, there wasn't much they could do. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home. I kept the curtains drawn, barely slept, and jumped at every little sound. My friends tried to comfort me, but they didn't understand. They said I was overreacting, that it was probably a prank or a coincidence. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It was coming from my bedroom window. My heart stopped. I lived on the 3rd floor. I forced myself to look. Slowly, I inched toward the window, my breath hitching with every step. When I finally pulled back the curtain, my blood ran cold. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. By the time I scrambled to my feet and looked again, the face was gone. The police came and searched the area but found no one. They said it was probably a drunk neighbor or a prank. I knew better. The next day, I installed extra locks on my windows and a security camera at my front door. I told myself I was taking back control, but the truth was, I was terrified. The camera caught him a week later. It was around midnight when the motion sensor activated. I checked the footage and saw him standing at my front door, staring directly into the camera. He was wearing the same hood, his face partially obscured, but his eyes were unmistakable. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't try to get in. He just stood there watching for almost an hour before walking away. I showed the footage to the police, but without a clear shot of his face, they couldn't do much. They suggested I consider moving. I didn't have the money to move, so I stayed. I stopped working late shifts and made sure I was never alone at night. For a while, things seemed to get better. Then I found the note. It was tucked under my pillow when I came home from work. I don't know how he got in. There were no signs of forced entry, and all the locks were still in place. The note simply said, "You can't hide from me." That night, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a friend for a while, then eventually moved to a new city. I thought I was safe until last week. I was walking to my car after work when I saw it, a single black glove lying on the hood of my car, and I knew he had found me.
Story number 3.
When I was 19, I moved into a tiny studio apartment on the edge of a small town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I loved the independence. The building was old, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but the rent was cheap, and the neighbors kept to themselves. The first time I noticed something strange was on a rainy Friday night. I was in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the door. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the building, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, and the scratching stopped the moment I looked. I told myself it was nothing and went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, just inches away on the other side of the door. The next morning, I found something odd on the doormat, a small, broken mirror. It was cracked down the center, and the glass glinted like it had just been placed there. I didn't touch it. Instead, I swept it into a dustpan and threw it away. That night, the scratching came back. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed a kitchen knife and flung the door open, but again, the hallway was empty. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Over the next few weeks, more things appeared outside my door. A single black feather, a child's doll with its head twisted backward, a piece of string tied in a noose. Each time I threw the items away, trying not to think about what they meant or who was leaving them. One night, the scratching didn't come from the door. It came from the window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing that would make it possible for someone to be outside my window. And yet, when I looked, I saw the faint outline of a figure pressed against the glass. They didn't move. They just stared at me, their breath fogging up the window. I froze, unable to move or scream. After what felt like an eternity, the figure disappeared, fading into the darkness. I called the police the next morning. They searched the area but found no signs of anyone. They said it was probably a prank or maybe a tree branch casting a shadow. But I knew what I saw. The following night, I stayed awake, gripping the knife, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again. This time, it came from the closet. I stared at the closet door, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept to the closet and flung the door open. It was empty. No clothes, no shoes, nothing. Just a dark, gaping void where my belongings should have been. Then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I moved back in with my parents, leaving everything behind. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. For months, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. Then last week, I received a package in the mail. It was my knife, the one I had kept by my bed, and it was covered in deep scratches. And now every night, I hear the scratching again. It's coming closer.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be just a summer job. Babysitting for the Thompsons sounded perfect. Easy money, free food, and plenty of downtime to study for my college classes. Their house was a massive, old Victorian at the edge of town. It had creaky floors, high ceilings, and long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch forever. The first few nights were uneventful. The Thompsons' daughter, Lily, was sweet but quiet. She was only 6 and loved to play with her dolls. She had dozens of them, lined up neatly on shelves in her room. "Do they all have names?" I asked one night, pointing to a particularly old and tattered doll with cracked porcelain skin and empty eyes. "That's Mr. Buttons," she said, clutching it tightly. "He's my favorite." Mr. Buttons made me uneasy. Something about the way his lifeless eyes seemed to follow me around the room gave me chills. But I didn't say anything. After all, it was just a doll. The first strange thing happened about a week in. I had put Lily to bed and was downstairs watching TV when I heard giggling. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind through the old house, but then I heard it again. Soft, high-pitched laughter. I went upstairs to check on Lily, but she was sound asleep, Mr. Buttons tucked under her arm. Probably just the neighbors, I told myself, even though the nearest house was a quarter-mile away. The next night, I heard footsteps. They started around midnight. Soft, shuffling steps that echoed through the hallway. I tiptoed out of the living room and peered up the stairs. Nothing. "Lily?" I called out, but there was no response. I crept upstairs and checked her room. She was sound asleep, just like the night before. But this time, Mr. Buttons was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring straight at the door. My stomach twisted. I could have sworn I had tucked him under her arm before she went to sleep. I tried to shake off the unease. It was just a doll. The next night was worse. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of a door creaking open. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from Lily's room. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The house was deathly quiet, except for the creak of the floorboards under my feet. When I reached her room, the door was wide open. Lily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked, rushing to her side. "He's mad," she whispered, clutching Mr. Buttons. "Who's mad?" "Mr. Buttons. He doesn't like you." A cold chill ran down my spine. "It's just a doll, Lily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He can't hurt anyone." She shook her head violently. "He can. He told me he can." That was it. I grabbed Mr. Buttons and took him downstairs. I stuffed him in a drawer in the kitchen and slammed it shut. "You stay there," I muttered, as if the doll could hear me. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, scratching, faint whispers, the sound of tiny footsteps. When I went to check the drawer in the morning, it was empty. I searched the entire house, but Mr. Buttons was gone. Later that day, Mrs. Thompson came home early. I told her what had happened, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, her face went pale. "I should have told you," she said, her voice trembling. "That doll, it's been in the family for generations. My grandmother used to say it was cursed, but I thought it was just an old wives' tale. I quit that day. I tried to put it behind me, but sometimes late at night I hear it again. The soft, high-pitched giggling and the faint sound of tiny footsteps. And I swear sometimes I wake up to find Mr. Buttons sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those lifeless eyes."
Story number 5.
I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. It was quiet, almost boring, but it felt safe. That all changed the summer I turned 17. It started with a series of strange break-ins around town. People reported hearing noises at night, but nothing was ever stolen. Just little things moved around. Chairs pulled away from tables, pictures turned upside down, doors left wide open. One night I was home alone. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I was looking forward to having the house to myself. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled in for a movie marathon. Around midnight I heard it, the faint sound of someone tapping on glass. It was so soft, I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I muted the TV and listened. The sound was coming from the back of the house where the kitchen window overlooked the yard. My heart raced as I crept toward the kitchen, gripping my phone tightly. The window was closed, but the blinds were slightly open, just enough for me to see out into the yard. That's when I saw him. A man stood just outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. His features were twisted into a grin, and his eyes locked onto mine as soon as I looked. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to run. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at me through the glass. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, I whispered, "There's someone outside my house." The man must have heard me because his grin widened. Then, he raised a single finger to his lips as if to shush me. The operator told me to stay on the line and hide until the police arrived. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on him, and darted into the pantry. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him now, moving around the house. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. Then I heard the back door handle jiggle. It was locked, but he kept trying, rattling it harder and harder. I held my breath, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Finally, the rattling stopped, and everything went silent. Minutes felt like hours as I crouched there, waiting for the police. When I finally heard their sirens, I nearly cried with relief. The officers searched the property but found no sign of the man. No footprints, no broken windows, nothing. It was like he had vanished. They told me it was probably a prank, some kid trying to scare me. But I knew better. The way he looked at me, the way he grinned, it wasn't a prank. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. One night, I woke up to a noise outside my bedroom window. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it through the glass. There on the other side was a message written in the condensation. "See you soon." I moved out of that house a month later, but even now, years later, I still feel like he's watching. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in the shadows or hear faint tapping on the glass, and I know one day he'll come back.
Story number 6.
When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. It was a charming old building with vintage character, high ceilings, hardwood floors, and big windows that let in plenty of light. The rent was surprisingly low, but the landlord mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly. I didn't ask questions. I was just happy to have my own space. At first, everything was fine, but then I started noticing small, strange things. It began with the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint creaking above me like someone was walking around. I lived on the top floor and there was no attic, so it didn't make sense. I told myself it was just the old building settling. A week later, I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. It was so soft, I thought it was part of a dream. But when I opened my eyes, the whispers stopped. Then I noticed the chair. I had an old rocking chair that sat in the corner of the living room. It was a hand-me-down from my grandmother, and I rarely used it. But every morning, I'd find it in a different position. Sometimes it was turned toward the window. Other times it was facing the couch. Once, it was tilted slightly forward, as if someone had just gotten up. I thought I was losing my mind. One night, I stayed up late working on my laptop. Around 2 a.m., I heard the creaking again. This time, it was louder, closer. I turned off the music I'd been playing and listened. The sound was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, but then just at the edge of the distorted view, I saw it. A shadow moving slowly, too deliberately to be a trick of the light. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told the landlord about the noises. He seemed uneasy and said he'd look into it, but his tone made me feel like he was hiding something. That evening, I noticed something new. Scratches. They were faint but deliberate, claw-like marks etched into the wooden floor beneath the rocking chair. I knelt down to inspect them and realized they formed a pattern. It looked almost like letters, but I couldn't make out what they said. I decided I couldn't stay there alone anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. The next day, I returned to grab more of my things. As I stepped into the apartment, a wave of cold air washed over me. The windows were all shut, but it felt like the middle of winter. Then I saw it. The rocking chair was moving. Not just a little sway like it had been bumped. It was rocking back and forth violently, slamming into the floor with a rhythmic thud. And in the corner of the room, I saw her. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and stringy hair. She was crouched low, her fingers dragging across the floor, carving deeper scratches into the wood. She looked up at me and smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "Mine," she whispered, her voice raspy and cold. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the building, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway across town. I called the landlord and demanded to know what was going on. He sighed heavily and finally admitted the truth. The previous tenant had died in the apartment. She was a recluse, barely leaving the building, and when they found her, she had been sitting in that rocking chair, her nails worn down to the bone from scratching at the floor. The landlord apologized, but it didn't matter. I never went back. Sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear it. The creak of a rocking chair and the faint sound of scratching growing louder and louder.
Story number 7.
When I was a child, my family lived in a sprawling, century-old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. My parents loved the charm of the old place, its wide porches, creaky wooden stairs, and the sense of history in every corner. But to me, it always felt wrong. The first night we moved in, I woke up to the sound of someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. The heavy thuds of boots on the wooden floor were unmistakable. I called out for my dad, but no one answered. When I peeked into the hallway, it was empty. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they brushed it off as the house settling. Old houses make noise, they said. But it wasn't just noises. Sometimes I'd find things moved around, books from the shelves stacked in neat piles on the floor, or chairs pulled out from the table as if someone had been sitting there. My mom thought I was playing tricks. I wasn't. Then there was the attic. The entrance to the attic was a small square door in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, just outside my room. I hated that door. It always felt like something was watching me from up there. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like the sound of a branch brushing against the side of the house. But as I listened, it grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the attic. I hid under my covers, heart pounding, until the sound finally stopped. The next morning, I told my dad. He grabbed a flashlight and pulled down the attic door to check. The narrow staircase unfolded with a groan, and the smell of dust and mildew wafted down. "There's nothing up here," he said after a few minutes. "Just old junk." But I knew better. Things got worse after that. I started having nightmares. Dark, vivid dreams about a man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. He would stand at the foot of my bed, just staring, his pale hands reaching out toward me. One night, I woke up from one of those dreams to find the attic door wide open. The stairs were unfolded, leading up into the darkness. I screamed, and my parents came running. My dad insisted it was the wind or maybe a loose latch. He closed the door and promised to check it in the morning. The next day, he found deep scratch marks on the inside of the attic door. After that, my parents started to believe me. My mom called a priest to bless the house, but it didn't help. The noises continued, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One evening, my older brother and I decided to investigate the attic ourselves. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the rickety stairs. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. In the far corner, we found a small, dusty trunk. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside the trunk were old photographs, yellowed letters, and a journal. The photos were of a man, tall, thin, with piercing eyes. It was the man from my nightmares. The journal belonged to him. As we flipped through the pages, we discovered he had lived in the house decades ago. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, and feeling a dark presence in the attic. The final entry was chilling. "I can't take it anymore. It wants me. It's calling me. Tonight, I'll join it." That night, we learned the truth. The man had hung himself in the attic. After we found the journal, the activity in the house grew more violent. Doors slammed shut, objects flew off shelves, and we all felt the icy grip of fear every time we climbed the stairs. Eventually, my parents decided enough was enough, and we moved out. Years later, I drove past the old farmhouse. It was abandoned, the windows boarded up and the paint peeling away. But as I looked up at the attic window, I swore I saw him, the man with the hollow eyes, staring back at me.
Story number 8.
In my early 20s, I rented a room in a large historic mansion that had been converted into apartments. The rent was cheap, and the house was beautiful, even if it felt a little too big for its current purpose. Each floor was split into separate living spaces, but the hallways and staircases remained intact, giving it the eerie feel of a place stuck between two lives. I lived on the second floor. My apartment was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and a kitchenette. It was perfect for me, but from the first night, something about the house felt off. The air always seemed colder in the hallway, even in the summer. The sound of footsteps echoed at odd hours, and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like a woman's faint laughter, but no one else was around. One night, I stayed up late working on a project. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft knock at my door. It wasn't forceful, just a faint tap, tap, tap. I froze. No one ever knocked on my door, especially not at that hour. Slowly, I crept to the peephole and looked out. The hallway was empty. I opened the door just enough to peer out. Still nothing. I told myself it was just the old house settling and went back to bed, but I barely slept. The next morning, I mentioned the knocking to my neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the house for years. She gave me a strange look. "You heard the knocking?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I nodded. She leaned in closer. "It's the lady. She's been here for as long as anyone can remember. If she knocks, you don't answer." "The lady?" I asked, laughing nervously. Her expression didn't change. She was the original owner of the house. They say she died here waiting for her husband to come back from the war. He never did. Now she waits for anyone who'll open the door. I laughed it off, but that night I double-locked my door just in case. Weeks went by without incident, and I started to forget about the knocking. Then, one stormy night, it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was soft but deliberate, like someone tapping with their nails. I stared at the door, paralyzed. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I crept toward the door and looked through the peephole. This time, I saw her. A woman stood in the hallway, her figure barely illuminated by the flickering light bulb. She wore a long, dark dress, and her hair was pinned up in a style that looked like it belonged in another century. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed on the door. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Please," she whispered. her voice muffled but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "Please let me in." I didn't move. She knocked again, louder this time. "I just want to talk." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something behind it. Something cold and menacing. I stayed frozen until the knocking stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole again, she was gone. The next morning I found something on the floor outside my door. A withered rose, blackened at the edges as if it had been burned. I moved out 2 weeks later. I've never gone back to the house, but sometimes late at night I think I hear it again. The faint sound of knocking growing louder and louder in my mind.
Story number 9.
When I was a kid, my family visited my grandmother every summer. She lived in a small, sleepy town in an old, rambling house that had been in the family for generations. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, with creaky floorboards, faded wallpaper, and an attic that no one ever went into. The house had a reputation in town. People whispered that it was haunted, but my grandmother always laughed off the rumors. "It's just an old house," she'd say, "nothing more." One summer, when I was about 10, I decided to sleep in the guest room on the 3rd floor. My parents thought it was strange. No one ever stayed up there, but I was eager to prove I wasn't afraid. The room was small, with a single bed, a dresser, and a large mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was old, the glass slightly warped, and it gave me an uneasy feeling. The first night was quiet. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside the window. But on the second night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming on wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the mirror. I stared at it, but the room was too dark to see anything clearly. The tapping stopped after a few seconds, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I told my grandmother about it. She seemed concerned, but quickly changed the subject. That night, I stayed up, determined to figure out what was going on. I kept a flashlight under my pillow and waited for the sound. Around 2 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, I grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the mirror. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a hand pressed against the inside of the glass. It was pale and thin. The fingers splayed out as if someone was trying to push through. I froze, unable to move or breathe. Then, slowly, the hand began to retreat, disappearing into the depths of the mirror. The surface rippled like water, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face. Dark, hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I screamed, and my parents came rushing in. By the time they turned on the lights, the mirror looked normal again. The next day, I begged my grandmother to let me sleep downstairs. She didn't argue. Before we left at the end of the summer, I overheard her talking to my mom. "She's too young to know," she said, her voice low. "But there's a reason no one sleeps in that room. The mirror belonged to your great aunt, and she didn't die peacefully." I never asked for more details. I didn't want to know. Years later, I returned to the house for my grandmother's funeral. The guest room on the 3rd floor was exactly as I remembered it. The mirror was still there, hanging on the wall. Out of morbid curiosity, I approached it and looked into the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw her, the hand, the face, the twisted smile. I left the room and never went back.